The meeting will now consider sub-item D, entitled Victim Assistance, Environmental Remediation, and International Cooperation and Assistance, Articles 6 and 7, of Agenda Item 11, entitled Consideration of the Status and Operation of the Treaty and Other Matters Important for Achieving the Objectives and Purpose of the Treaty. The meeting has before it the report of the co-chairs of the Informal Working Group on Victims Assistance, Environmental Remediation, International Cooperation Assistance, document TPNW MSP/2025/4. I'd like to invite now the co-chairs of the Informal Working Group on Victims Assistance, Environmental Remediation, International Cooperation Assistance, representative of Kazakhstan Kiribati, to introduce their report. So, first, Azamat.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, distinguished delegates, it is both a privilege and solemn duty to address you today in this crucial discussion. During the period leading up to the third meeting of state parties, Kazakhstan and Kiribati, as co-chairs of the Informal Working Group on Victim Assistance, Environmental Remediation, and International Cooperation and Assistance, convened substantive consultations with state parties in accordance with paragraph F of Decision 4 of the first meeting of state parties. The co-chairs invited diverse stakeholders to the Informal Working Group discussions, including representatives of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICRC, academia, affected communities from the Asia-Pacific and Central Asia region, both which have experienced the humanitarian and environmental effects of nuclear weapons. The co-chairs also convened a series of separate informal meetings with representatives of civil society and affected communities. The co-chairs circulated a survey in April 2024 to assess the views of state parties, civil society, academia, and affected communities on elements of an international trust fund for victim assistance and environmental remediation from the consequences of the use or testing of nuclear weapons. The co-chairs also requested the Scientific Advisory Group to discuss the questions contained in the survey. Consequently, the Scientific Advisory Group established a sub-working group on Article 6 and 7. Numerous affected communities in state parties and signatories to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as well as in other countries, continue to suffer from the harm caused by use or testing of nuclear weapons. For example, in the case of Kazakhstan, from 1949 to 1989, about 456 nuclear tests were conducted at the Semipalatinsk test site, including 30 surface, 86 aerial, and 340 underground nuclear explosions. Those tests not only contaminate the test site and the surrounding environment, but also expose the local population to radioactive fallout. Studies have found that even 40 to 48 years after exposure to radiation, the average annual prevalence of the levels of most categories and classes of diseases among the affected population and their descendants was significantly higher than in the control groups. The studies also found significantly higher rates of lung and bronchial cancer among both men and women, breast cancer in women, eye cancer, cancer of brain and other parts and central nervous system, as well as of the hematomic and lymphoid tissue than in the control groups. In the case of Kiribati, from 1957 to 1962, Kiribati Island was the site of 33 nuclear tests. The 500 citizens of Kiribati living in Kiribati at the time of the tests received little protection and inadequate warning. Many members of this community experienced a multiple of illnesses and health complications, that is, cancer, congenital disabilities, and the birth defects. Dear colleagues, in the informal consultations conducted by co-chairs with affected communities in both Asia-Pacific and Central Asia regions, many affected community members discussed their medical ailments, including the severe chronic and inborn diseases, psychological trauma, and intergenerational genetic problems. They also expressed frustration that medical studies conducted by states responsible for nuclear tests have remained mostly classified, leading to the further trauma and, in some cases, hindering proper medical care for both first, second, third, and fourth generation survivors. As a result, many affected communities stated that the trust fund should prioritize medical and psychological assistance to victims and assist in the restoration and development of infrastructure in affected areas. Co-chairs consider the establishment of International Trust Fund to be an urgent matter. The proposed trust fund could serve the following key functions: provide humanitarian assistance to victims. Resources from an International Trust Fund could be used to conduct studies on the needs of affected communities. The establishment of the trust fund need not to be dependent on the completion of a global needs assessment, given the self-evident severity and pressing nature of the problem. The trust fund could provide support for assessing and addressing environmental contamination from the use or testing of nuclear weapons. For example, assessments of levels of background gamma radiation and mapping of the hotspots by scientists are crucial to informing the development of national policies. Even the environment can never be fully restored to its pre-contamination state. Every step towards remediation would be beneficial for reducing the inherent risks posed by radioactive contamination. International Trust Fund could help state parties to advance the implementation of Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. Article 7, paragraph 4 of the treaty specifies that each state party in a position to do so shall provide assistance for the victims of the use or testing of nuclear weapons or those nuclear explosive devices. An International Trust Fund would help state parties to fulfill their responsibilities under Article 7 by equipping them with a suitable vehicle for providing international cooperation and assistance to affected states parties. In turn, the assistance would help affected states parties meet their obligation under Article 6. The establishment of the International Trust Fund can also help promote the universalization of the treaty. Specifically, the establishment of such a trust fund could encourage non-treaty states that have traditionally supported victim assistance provisions in their treaties to make contributions and engage directly with the states parties to the treaty. There is an ample ground for utilizing a trust fund as a means of providing an opportunity for non-treaty states to engage with and support the treaty on a broader basis. A decision to contribute to International Trust Fund could be utilized to further encourage the contributing state to examine the potential of gradually increasing its involvement in the treaty in other aspects and activities. Now, dear colleagues, I would like to invite my colleague, the co-chair from Kiribati, to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President, Excellencies, fellow co-chair and colleagues. The co-chairs also considered the feasibility of an international trust fund in accordance with the portion of the mandate granted to the working group at the outcome of the second meeting of state parties. The interest in the prospect of a trust fund, present since early in the history of the treaty, indicates strong support for the idea of establishing such a mechanism. The Vienna Action Plan provides a mandate for state parties to engage in substantive discussions on the establishment of an international trust fund. Specifically under Action 29, state parties are called upon to discuss the feasibility of and propose possible guidelines for establishing an international trust fund to provide financial support for victim assistance and environmental remediation. In 2023, at the second meeting of state parties, in its Decision 4, took further steps and requested that a report be submitted to the third meeting of state parties with recommendations related to the feasibility of and possible guidelines for the establishment of an international trust fund for victim assistance and environmental remediation with the aim of examining the establishment of such a trust fund by the third meeting of state parties as a priority. During the intersessional period, as mentioned previously by my colleague, state parties and other stakeholders engaged in substantive discussions, responded to a survey on the establishment of an international trust fund, and delivered meaningful presentations to the co-chairs. Additionally, affected communities in particular have voiced strong support for an international trust fund, especially from the Asia-Pacific and Central Asia regions. They stressed the need to prioritize funding projects that support medical and psychological assistance to victims, restoration and development of infrastructure, ecological rehabilitation of lands, research on the long-term effects of the testing of nuclear weapons, preservation of the historical and cultural heritage of affected communities and regions, and educational projects for women and young people. They also underscored that the success of an international trust fund depends on whether the interests of victims are taken into account. They emphasized the need to establish an advisory panel within the fund's governing body, and the need for members of that governing body to convene regular consultations with both youth and civil society organizations from affected communities. They called for robust mechanisms on transparency, accountability, and oversight, and recommended that awareness-raising campaigns on the establishment of the fund be conducted to ensure in particular that the authorities of affected communities are adequately informed about ongoing efforts to establish such a fund. The co-chairs contend that existing trust funds within the context of international criminal, human rights, and disarmament law provide clear precedents for the establishment of an international trust fund under the treaty. In presentation from many experts, including a representative from Harvard Law School, they explained that while no trust fund provides a perfect model, state parties can learn from existing funds to establish one under the TPNW. These include the Victims' Trust Fund of the International Criminal Court, the Voluntary Trust Fund of the International Support Network for Victims of Chemical Weapons, the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture, the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. We've also examined other trust funds that relate to conventional arms or the peaceful use of nuclear energy, including the Arms Trade Treaty, Voluntary Trust Fund, the Peaceful Uses Initiative of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations Trust Fund Facility Supporting Cooperation on Arms Regulation, and the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Assistance in Mine Action. Of those, the Peaceful Uses Initiative and the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Assistance in Mine Action are particularly relevant to the environmental remediation objectives of the treaty. We've also examined and looked at the potential of how the trust fund can be an effective and impactful tool to support victim assistance and environmental remediation. This is evident from the fact that in the past, even limited support from the international community has enabled states to implement special programs and projects for the treatment and care of affected communities. For instance, Kazakhstan partnered with the IAEA to develop and implement projects for the rehabilitation of areas exposed to nuclear contamination, with the University of Haifa to study genetic changes in descendants whose parents were exposed to radiation, and with Hiroshima University to assess psychological consequences for the populations living in territories subjected to nuclear weapon tests. In addition, the co-chairs in August of 2024 shared with state parties an initial draft of the terms of reference document for a trust fund on victim assistance and environmental remediation from the consequences of the use or testing of nuclear weapons. The draft terms of reference document addresses the following: guiding principles, a board or committee to govern the trust fund, contributions to the fund, applications for assistance, application of the financial regulations and rules of the UN, reporting, the implementing office, program support costs, public disclosure, closure of the fund, and possible revisions. The co-chairs conducted extensive informal consultations with state parties, civil society groups, and affected communities, and solicited inputs with a view to refining the draft terms of reference over the intercessional period. While various and sometimes differing views regarding certain elements of the draft terms of reference were expressed, the overall level of interest and engagement by all stakeholders suggests that a trust fund remain a feasible and beneficial way to implement Articles 6 and 7. A few areas in particular seem to require additional work. State parties express differing views on the involvement of affected communities, non-governmental organizations, and academia in different elements of the trust fund. They also had differing views on voluntary contributions from different actors to the trust fund, including in particular whether state parties should allow states not parties and other actors to contribute. Many members of affected communities and civil society groups expressed the need for the fund to accept contributions from all actors and underscored the importance of inclusivity in the decision-making process. The draft terms of reference represents the co-chair's best efforts to produce a compromise text based on the discussions that occurred in the intercessional period. The document will remain a non-paper that will be used for internal reference only within the working group during the next intercessional period. Further, the co-chairs developed a set of guiding principles they recommend inform ongoing discussions in the intercessional period between the third meeting of state parties and the first review conference. These include the following. The trust fund and its design and operation should uphold and be guided by the following key principles. Demand-driven. The fund's grant making should be aimed at meeting the needs and priorities identified by affected states, communities, individuals, and their representative organizations. Voluntariness. Contributions to the fund will be voluntary and may be solicited from eligible governments, intergovernmental organizations, national institutions, non-governmental organizations, private entities, and individuals. Inclusivity and partnerships. Affected communities and individuals are expected to be consulted as appropriate at all stages of the trust fund. Accountability and transparency. All entities and activities associated with the trust fund, including the fund's governing board, donors, and grant recipients, should be accountable to the state parties through the meeting of state parties and the review conference. Integrity to safeguard the treaty. The activities of the fund and its end goals should always advance and uphold the treaty's goals, credibilities, and authority. Sustainability. State parties should take all appropriate measures to ensure that the fund remains sustainable. Additionally, the governing board of the trust fund, either a committee or executive body, the composition of which will be determined by the state parties based on the principles of gender balance and equitable geographical distribution. And that entity will review grant applications, among other functions. The trust fund should support a wide range of projects, including those that assist affected state parties and victims, including survivors, promote measures towards environmental remediation, and build capacity for such activities. It could support projects at any stage of these activities, including projects related to national assessments of the humanitarian and environmental impacts of the use or testing of nuclear weapons and development of national plans to address these impacts. Trust fund grants may be directly utilized by or in conjunction with a wide array of competent implementing partners whose scope of work is aligned with the object and purpose of the trust fund and the treaty. In addition to these guiding principles, a few more, we've also identified possible draft decisions for the adoption by the third meeting of state parties. These include the idea of that we should have further focused discussions under the informal working group on victim assistance, environmental remediation and assistance, taking into account the possible guidelines, technical provisions, or terms of reference for the establishment of an international trust fund for victim assistance and environmental remediation from the consequences of the use or testing of nuclear weapons that is viable, effective, and sustainable. A report that will be submitted to the first review conference that contains guidelines, technical provisions, or terms of reference of an international trust fund for victim assistance and environmental remediation from the consequences of the use or testing of nuclear weapons, with the aim of establishing, if possible, such a trust fund at the review conference. And then finally, to ensure flexibility and promote progress and implementation of the humanitarian provisions of the treaty. The establishment of the fund may proceed in a phased manner informed by the set of guiding principles and with the involvement of stakeholders in the development of guidelines and technical provisions or terms of reference. These possible draft decisions were submitted to the President of the third meeting of state parties, as well as to all state parties of the TPNW, and they've been under consideration and in the process of being negotiated. Thank you.
I thank Azamat and Christian, co-chairs of the Informal Working Group on Victim Assistance, Environmental Remediation, International Cooperation and Assistance.